So the Phillips curve, we're going to learn a lot about it today. So the short run Phillips curve, now what is it? It's an inverse relationship between the inflation and unemployment rates of a given economy. So when the unemployment is high, the wages increase slowly, so therefore there's a lower level of inflation. And think about it, that makes sense because when the unemployment rates are high, there's less workers being employed, so there's less consumption, less spending, so wages increase more slowly, and therefore prices increase more slowly, so there's a lower level of inflation. And now, when the unemployment rates are low, the wages increase more rapidly and therefore have a higher rate of inflation in the economy. And that makes sense again, because when the unemployment rate is low, there's more workers being employed, more spending, more consumption, and therefore prices increase more rapidly in the economy. So here's a graph of the short-run Phillips curve, and as you can see, there's a negative inverse correlation between the unemployment and inflation rates of a given economy. You can draw it either curved like this, or you can also draw it linear. It doesn't really matter on the AP test. And as you can see, when the unemployment rate starts to increase, the inflation rate starts to decrease. So it really exemplifies that inverse relationship. So problems with the Phillips curve. So Milton Friedman, one of the greatest economists of the modern age, had certain problems with the Phillips curve. So he thought that real wages would adjust to the equal supply of labor and the equal supply for demand for labor, which would then create a national rate of unemployment, which is basically the unemployment rate where the economy functions at equilibrium, where it's with its maximum output with its given set of resources and technology and workers. So it's kind of confusing in logic. So just to sum it up in an understandable way, Friedman basically thought that any changes in inflation would not change the natural rate of unemployment, so that there'd be no trade-off between increases in inflation rate and the unemployment levels in the economy. So here's a graph of that idea, which became known as the long-run Phillips curve, where there's no trade-off between increased levels of inflation and the natural rate of unemployment, which turns out to be a vertical line. I think it's green, colorblind, so I can't tell, but it's the vertical line that functions at the natural rate of unemployment in the economy. And also you see the two downsloping lines of the two short-run Phillips curves, which also has the other idea of that inverse relationship between the unemployment and inflation rates of a given economy. So stagflation. So this was a phenomena caused by the oil OPEC crisis in the 1970s because of the U.S. Conflicts and the Western nations' fights with the Arab countries over Israel. Can't remember the specific war, the specific conflict, but basically the Western nations made a lot of Arab nations very angry because of their involvement over Israel and aiding Israel with supplies and military and goods. So they decreased the availability of oil to the Western countries. The price of oil actually rose from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel, and this increased prices of oil also increased the price of other resources as well. And because of that, there's a decreased amount of aggregate supply, which makes sense because all these prices were increasing like crazy, which then decreased the GDP level. And because of Oken's law, GDP and unemployment are inversely linked, so a decreased level of GDP which would then increase the unemployment rate exponentially. So stagflation basically shifts the Phillips curve to the right with a decreased amount of aggregate supply, which also results in an increased amount of both unemployment and inflation. It's also known as cost push inflation, as the lower amount of supply makes all the prices increase by vast amounts. So stagflation is just horrible because it's slow economic growth, but also high inflation rates. So it has the worst of both worlds, as it doesn't have a high economic growth to balance out high inflation rates. It has low economic growth and high inflation rates, which makes it very hard for the economy to recover from a recession. And it's also an effect of a negative supply shock, because as you can see, when there's a smaller amount of goods and the aggregate supply shift to the left, that's a negative supply shock, and it results in stagflation of the Phillips curve. So to shifting the Phillips curve in the short run, it comes from shifting the aggregate supply to the left or the right. So supply shocks and any changes in aggregate supply changes the Phillips curve, like changes in production costs, cost of raw materials, taxes and subsidies. Those are the factors that change the Phillips curve. And just remember that any changes in aggregate supply affect the Phillips curve in the opposite way. So decreases in aggregate supply shift the Phillips curve to the right, and increases in aggregate supply shifts the Phillips curve to the right. to the left, I mean. So they're oppositely linked. Just remember that. So shifting the Phillips curve in the long run. So the long run Phillips curve does not change at all unless the national rate of unemployment specifically changes, and that would only change with immigration, the working population becoming more skilled, and the labor force becoming more skilled, and new advances in technology. And those are the only factors that affect the national rate of unemployment, which would then affect the Phillips curve in the long run, because remember, the Phillips curve in the long run is just a vertical line with no trade-off with unemployment and inflation. And finally, shifts in AD do not shift the Phillips curve, but they move the economy from one point on the Phillips curve to another. So increases in aggregate demand would shift the Phillips curve leftward, would shift the point on the Phillips curve leftwards and upwards, like A to B, and then decreases in aggregate supply would shift a point on the Phillips curve down to the right, like B to A. So thank you for watching. I really hope you guys learned a lot, and stay tuned for next time.